I believe we have a duty as legislators to give people choice and to change the law.
They would much rather see an improvement to palliative care rather than assisted dying. What do you make of that argument?
I don't think some of these conversations would have happened without this bill.
It must feel like a huge responsibility.
I do feel pressure, but I do think this is our opportunity.
So Kim, you've welcomed us into your House of Commons office with a beautiful view over the Thames. They treat you all right.
You're very welcome.
They treat you Yorkshireman right, entirely rightly. We're going to talk a little bit about your politics now. You came to this moment, but obviously you are in the spotlight at the moment because of your, let's give it its proper name, the Terminally Ill Adults End of Life Bill, which you're currently sponsoring through Parliament through a private member's bill. Let's just go big picture at the start. You came top of the private member's ballot, which for people who aren't familiar basically means that an MP can introduce their own piece of legislation to the Commons. Why did you want to do this bill? Because MPs who come top of that ballot do get a lot of requests, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, so you get drawn top of the ballot, and literally my phone did not stop ringing, my emails were coming in, lots of different campaign groups, lots of different organisations with lots of different ideas, because you're quite right, if you get drawn top of that ballot, there is a chance that you get to change the law. And whilst that created a lot of pressure, and I found it quite intense, I also thought this is why we're here. This is an opportunity to do something that really will change things and help people, and that's why I came into politics. And I'd always had my own personal views around assisted dying and choice at the end of life, but they were really crystallised when that moment came. And I started doing further research and looking into the issue, and what I quite quickly realised was that we have got a situation which is just not fit for purpose. And there's different layers to the debate and the discussion. There is the conversation, which I firmly believe in, around autonomy and choice and dignity. But there's also looking at the legal framework, which doesn't exist at the moment. And as soon as I started hearing more and more stories about people who are having to make really difficult decisions at the end of their life around what their death looks like, people taking their own lives through suicide, people having the choice, if they can afford to go to a different country, to end their life in a manner of their choosing. And then really harrowing, traumatic stories of people who have had very difficult deaths, irrespective of having had very good palliative care. So once you start to unpick all that, you see something's wrong here and something has to change. And I was very, very clear about that. And yeah, the journey has been pretty intense so far. We've got the second reading next week, but I remain absolutely resolute that something has to change.
And what was it in particular? Was there a particular story or something that you heard or something that someone said to you that made you think, this is what I've got to do? Because it would be an enormous social change. I mean, arguably it's been pointed out, perhaps the biggest social change in this country since perhaps even the abortion bill, certainly since gay marriage came in about a decade or so ago. Was there something in particular?
I think I'm a problem solver, and I am also a person who has a real drive when I see injustice. And when I heard the stories of people who were in a position where they had certain options but didn't have the option that many of these people wanted around, you know, the fear that people have when they're terminally ill, and being really clear, this is just about terminally ill people, the fear that they have about what their end could look like. And I met with people who knew about the condition that they'd got, and they knew about other deaths that people had had, which were really, really horrible and harrowing and painful. And then I heard the stories of people, as I say, who'd taken their own lives. Paul Blomfield, who was an ex-member of Parliament who stood down this time, his father had terminal cancer. And Paul found him having taken his own life. And the trauma that creates for families is just horrendous. The inequity of Switzerland and Dignitas, where if you've got £10,000, £15,000, you can get on a plane and go and have an assisted death, which is traumatic in its own way. I mean, the stories about that are horrible as well. I had a lady who travelled with her husband and she felt like a criminal. And the reality is, potentially she is a criminal. She's considered a criminal because the law as it stands means that if you do assist somebody, you could be prosecuted. Now, we know that that doesn't often happen, but that fear that people describe of having that hanging over them is terrifying. And I met a young woman called Katie, and her mum had an assisted death in Switzerland, but Katie and her sister didn't go with her mum because they were so scared of what that would mean for them. Her dad did go. So a very, very lonely journey, particularly for the person who comes back and then arrives back in this country thinking, are the police going to be waiting for me? So there's a real sense of things just being wrong on so many levels. You don't have a funeral if you go to Switzerland. There's no proper funeral. You're shrouded in secrecy because you can't tell family and friends. And then the deaths of people who have had huge amounts of pain and suffering, having had good palliative care, but the stories of people, and they are graphic stories, and I apologise for that to some degree, but we need to hear the stories of the woman. Her husband was 48, he had incurable bowel cancer, very, very poorly for quite some time, and then at the end he got a blockage and he died a horrible death, which she witnessed, where he had 5 hours of fecal vomiting. Now, no family should have to go through that. He shouldn't have had to go through that. The family shouldn't have had to witness that. She's now got post-traumatic stress disorder, which is very common when you've had harrowing deaths like that. And she will never get over that. The gentleman I met who'd been married to his wife for 40 years, she got a horrible incurable cancer. She had good palliative care, but she essentially took 5 days to choke to death. And she's screaming to him, please, please, please help me. And he describes how he was stood over her with a pillow, and she wanted him to end the pain and suffering for her, and he couldn't do it because he didn't want her last memory of him to be of him stood over her with a pillow. And he's crying as he's telling me this story. Now, all those things add up to a situation where I believe we have a duty as legislators to give people choice and to change the law so that we have got a far more robust system than we have at the moment. So it's partly about choice, dignity and autonomy, but it's also about, that legal framework whereby, someone who let's say that gentleman had helped his wife, then he could be prosecuted.
Could you just explain, because I think this gets lost maybe in this discussion around this at the moment, which often gets bogged down in kind of the process, what your bill would do and what the kind of what the circumstances are, because they are quite limited, aren't they? And maybe just explain as well, and I actually wasn't quite kind of a favour with this distinction before reading into it, the difference between what you're proposing, which is assisted dying, and euthanasia, which we might think are synonymous, but they're actually different, aren't they?
Yeah, they are very different, and that's why I've been really clear about what the bill is. And look, if this bill passes, it will be the most robust piece of legislation in the world. The advantage we have in this country is that this is happening in 31 other jurisdictions, 13 other countries, so we can have a look at what good practice looks like. We can also have a look at practice that we wouldn't want to have in this country, and people often use the example of Canada and some of the Benelux countries, and I'm not proposing that at all, to be very, very clear. This is a very strict set of criteria, and if I'm honest, some of the hardest conversations I've had has been with people who think it's too strict, because there are people who wouldn't be able to access assisted dying under this legislation, and those have been difficult conversations to have as well. But this would be for terminally ill people, so dying people, and one of the best expressions I've heard has been, it's not about ending life, it's about shortening death, and it's not a choice of living or dying, it's a choice about how you die. So once you frame it like that, I hope that provides reassurance that there is a very specific set of people who this apply to. They would have to have an initial conversation with the doctor. The doctor has a duty to explain the range of options that are available to them. Then if they want to go forward and start the procedure, they would sign a declaration. There would be a thorough consultation. 2 doctors would be involved in the process. So they are checking for capacity. They are clarifying that this person is indeed terminally ill. They're ensuring that there is no coercion or pressure put on that individual. So checks and balances. And along the way, at any point, the person can change their mind. And then it would have to go to a High Court judge to add an extra layer of safeguarding. And again, some people have been critical and have said that's actually too hard, because you're dealing with someone who is dying. And reports from other countries, some of the doctors I've spoken to in places like California and Australia, where they have a very similar model to what I'm proposing, will say, actually often people die before the process has been completed, and that breaks my heart as well. So, but I was very, very clear that this had to be a very robust process with safeguards upon safeguards, and I think that's the piece of legislation that we've come up with, and I'm very proud of that.
That the critique that is most commonly made, and this includes members of the cabinet have said that they're concerned about this. They talk about the slippery slope, and they say that, okay, Kim's bill is very, very tightly defined, but that it could become something else. And indeed, we have seen, and the Canada example, you're right, it is different. It is a different system, but it has been expanded over time. And indeed, at the moment, it is still scheduled, although it's been delayed, to even end up including people with mental health problems. Yeah. Now, a lot of people would obviously find that abhorrent. How do you
as
stop?
do I.
Yeah.
Just for the record.
But how do you, yeah. But I suppose the question is, therefore, how do we know that we will not have a similar experience, that we won't slide down that slippery slope?
Yeah, well, the way our system works is Parliament passes the law, and that is the law. We don't have a system where I believe what's happening in Canada, where the courts can then get involved and they can start to change and adapt the law. Our system just doesn't work like that. Parliament is sovereign.
The Canadian courts basically said that they couldn't define it in that way. If they offered it to terminally ill people, they had to offer it to other people.
Yeah, and that's a very different system from ours. Once this law is enacted, if it is, then those criteria are the criteria. And that's why I very intentionally entitled the bill Terminally Ill Adults, End of Life. It's not assisted dying. The title of the bill isn't even assisted dying. So it's very, very clear who this bill is aimed at. And that title can never be changed. So once the law passes, those are the criteria. And again, like I say, other jurisdictions do things slightly differently. But that's the reason the courts have thrown this back to Parliament and said, Parliament has to decide. This is about the sovereignty of Parliament and the law that we believe should be enacted. So it's a very different system to other countries. And the other thing I would say is, I've been very clear in the bill, this is not about mental health. It's not about people with disabilities. This is about people who are dying and are not going to get better. And I've spent a lot of my career working in health and well-being, and I'd be the first person to advocate for everybody living the best life they possibly can and being as healthy as they possibly can. But sadly, we know we've got a population which is living for a lot longer. We've got far more instances of horrible, nasty diseases and illnesses, and we have to have a situation which provides for that and accommodates for that, so that we're not seeing people having huge amounts of suffering, and we are giving them the choice that I believe someone who is dying should have at the end of life. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not lots of other conversations to have around things like palliative care, around the rights of disabled people, around mental health provision, but this bill is so tight. It is about people who are dying and haven't got very long left to live, and giving them the choice and the autonomy that I believe they deserve.
I mean, the other critique, which is linked to the slippery slope one, is the idea that, and we've heard the Health Secretary say this, that people might feel pressured to end their life earlier than they ought to because they don't want to be a burden, which is, you can absolutely imagine how someone could end up in that psychological space. It's what people often say when they're dying or they're ill, right? How do you safeguard against that? Because I know that your bill contains very strict potential criminal sanction, I think up to 14 years, for someone who were proven to have done that. But how could you ever prove that? What safeguards could you actually put in place?
I think the big thing around coercion is, look, at the moment we've got a situation whereby, and it was Max Hill, the former Director of Public Prosecutions, who said this, we check for coercion now when someone is dead. It's a little bit late. So now we would be checking for coercion throughout the whole process.
How do you do that?
Well, that's about robust training for doctors and medical professionals, but it's also about the fact, look, I've spoken to lots of doctors about this, and they say they do this all the time anyway in the relationship that they have with their patients. So you want to make sure it's the patient that's making the decision, whether that's things like whether you go into a care home or not. Doctors are very good at connecting with their patients and understanding where their motivation is coming from. And at the moment, as I say, individuals particularly who have taken their own lives, we're not checking whether they've been coerced into it. So at the moment there is no legal framework which checks for coercion. So I think the fact that we've made it a criminal offence, I think sends a huge signal. The fact that this also runs alongside a broader debate in society around things like coercive control, we are much more aware of these things, and quite right too, that I think we're in a situation now whereby with really robust training around those issues, alongside the skill set that we know that doctors have and judges have, making it a criminal offence, asking questions upon questions of the patient, this is a very thorough, very robust process, then I think that creates a much safer system than we've currently got and provides layers of safeguards that currently just don't exist.
Are you concerned that in a survey of Canadians who ended their lives under their system, which I accept is a different system, but nonetheless, although the vast majority did say that they wanted to die because they'd lost their ability to engage in meaningful life activities, but more than 1/3 did say that their desire to do so was in part informed by a feeling that they were a perceived burden on family, friends or caregivers. I mean, that's a fact.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. Canada clearly a much broader set of criteria, nothing like we've been proposing at the moment.
But the impulse was the same.
But yeah, and I think that is the conversation that would take place with the doctors. So if someone is sitting there saying, I might as well just go on being a burden to everyone, the doctor will clearly pick up on that and will clearly say, hang on a minute, this is about you and it's about your choice.
But if they still said, I want to do that anyway, would, under your system, it still happen?
Well, there is an argument that having personal choice and autonomy is part of the whole process. However, they would have to be assessed to having the capacity and making sure that no one else has coerced them into doing that. So I appreciate that is a very delicate issue. I mean, there are people who've said to me, and I think my mum would probably say this to me, but surely being concerned about being a burden is a legitimate reason as well, in terms of, I know I wouldn't want to be a burden to people, I can say that to you now in the clear light of day, but that's very different to people saying, I'm doing this because I feel like I'm being a burden.
But you can imagine a world in which that would become the primary, that their lives are being shortened because of that. And I suppose that's exactly what the critics of your bill are worried about.
Well, but we're saying these are people who are already dying, so they've not got very long left to live. You are taking a holistic approach. You'd be speaking to them about their level of pain. You'd be speaking to them about the other options that are available to them in terms of palliative care and medical help and assistance. You'd be speaking to them, if you need to speak to a psychiatrist, you speak to a psychiatrist about it. You get help around mental health and capacity. So it's a very holistic approach. And if the doctor concludes that that is their only motivation, then there is options available to speak to other healthcare professionals about it. I had a good meeting yesterday with the Association of Psychiatrists, so they're part of the conversation. The British Medical Association are part of the conversation, the Palliative Care Association for Palliative Medicine. So I have consulted widely with experts on this. And as you might expect, there are actually a range of views. But what we must remember is we're dealing with very skilled professionals who, if the bill were to pass, would also then, if they opted in to be part of this scheme, would have training about these really delicate issues.
One of the things that people sometimes say, indeed the Health Secretary said, is that they would much rather see an improvement to palliative care rather than assisted dying. What do you make of that argument?
Well, I think it was the minister who's got responsibility for palliative care at the moment said only a few days ago, it's not an either or. And it isn't an either or. I've had various meetings with Hospice UK, Sue Ryder, Marie Curie, and I sat in a meeting here in Parliament yesterday for the all-party parliamentary group for hospices. Let's have that conversation as well. Let's improve palliative care. And do you know what I'm really pleased about? I don't think some of these conversations would have happened without this bill. It has turbocharged the conversation about palliative care.
But do you think palliative care can be enough?
For some people, palliative care cannot be enough. And that's the crux of one of the problems that we're facing. I met another lady the other day, and her mum had liver cancer and esophageal cancer. And the choice that she had was, which one do you want to kill you? Because one of them's going to kill you. So what we'll do, we'll treat the liver cancer and we'll let the esophageal cancer run its course. And that lady described to me her mum's death. And it was horrible. And she said to me, Kim, do you know what I remember more than anything? The smell in the room as the tumours burst. Now, she had palliative care. She had good palliative care. But that was her end because of the disease that she'd got. Now, those stories are traumatic. And what makes me so sad is that woman had this amazing mum who'd lived this amazing life. And she's got all those precious memories. But she's also now got that memory of her mum's death.
Have you been annoyed? I know you don't want to talk about process, I understand it, because the issues are bigger. But have you been a little bit annoyed that we know that this is an unusual vote because it's a free vote, the government's not got an official position, it's an unusual thing. And the Cabinet Secretary did tell Cabinet Ministers that they ought not to really get involved in the debate. But we have seen Cabinet Ministers getting involved in the debate. The Health Secretary, who would be in charge of administering and implementing your proposals, has been quite clear about his opposition. Have you been irritated by any of that?
I haven't been irritated. I think it's been a really difficult thing for people to navigate, whether they're cabinet members or ministers or indeed any other MP, because it is a free vote, quite right too. The Prime Minister's been very clear about that, and that is absolutely how it should be. This is a vote of conscience, and I firmly believe in that. But ultimately, MPs, even though sometimes people don't like to acknowledge it, are human beings, and we do all have our own views and opinions. So I think, particularly if you're on the record as having voted previously on this issue, it's fairly clear for many people what your views are. So I think it's been a delicate balance for politicians who've been speaking about this in the media to say what their views are whilst making it really clear that this isn't a government view. But actually Peter Kyle did it brilliantly this morning. He was on the media and he said, look, this is my view. I voted for this previously and I would vote for it again, but that isn't the view of the government. And I think that's fine. So it's been a difficult thing to navigate. But the good thing about our democracy is on the 29th of November, there's 650 MPs and every MP gets a vote.
I mean, politics, it strikes me, politics is unusual, isn't it? In the sense that, in many ways, we could talk about that, but in many ways it's very unusual. But one of the ways it's unusual is that there are actually a very large number of religious MPs. It's actually, I mean, and I think it's a really interesting thing about, religious people often come into politics because there's
they want to do good.
They want to do good, exactly. They're motivated by, the shining city on the hill. They want to change things, do good for their fellow man. But it does mean that maybe this debate in particular, it strikes me as quite influenced by the private views. It's not that we talk about it in religious terms or politicians talk about it in religious terms, but it's often quite influenced by religious people.
Yeah, well, I think people have different views for different reasons, but I think you're absolutely right. It wouldn't make sense to have the debate without considering faith and people's religious views. And actually what I found doing the research is that there are a variety of views within people of faith and faith communities. So I met with the then Archbishop of Canterbury on a few weeks ago on a Monday, and I met with the previous Archbishop of Canterbury, Lord Carey, on the Wednesday, and they have totally different views on the subject. Lord Carey has campaigned on this issue for nearly 20 years now.
Does it frustrate you a bit though, in the sense that it?
No, it doesn't frustrate me. I think it's really interesting. I think it's really fascinating. And do you know, the best comments that I've heard from people of faith have been people who have said to me, I wouldn't want this because of my religious beliefs, but who am I to deny other people the choice? And that really resonated with me very early on.
A bit like the abortion debate in that regard.
Absolutely. And I had a vicar come up to me last weekend in the constituency and he was furious because, and I won't name any names, but the bishop had written to him and he said, who is the bishop to tell me what to think? I have my views on this subject and I will maintain those views. I had another lady came up to me. She said, Kim, I'm a Christian, but I've got terminal cancer and I just want to be able to choose. So I think it's fair to say there are a range of views within faith communities. And I think what's important for MPs is that whatever our own personal views are, for whatever reason, we have a duty to represent our constituents, we have a duty to listen to the debate, and we have a duty to make our decision based on that broader debate, rather than necessarily just for what our individual personal views are.
PM spoken to you about it? Have you spoken to him about it?
No, I haven't spoken to the Prime Minister about this. I mean, he is on record as his views and thoughts on assisted dying, informed by his work as the Director of Public Prosecutions. But I have to be honest, Number 10 and the government have been very hands-off, which I think is absolutely right. That's what they said they would do. But, again, he's another person who is on record as knowing what he thinks because of his legal experience.
We were talking before we were recording. I remember coming to do, when I was at Newsnight, coming to do a piece with you when you were running in the by-election for Batley and Spen, the constituency as it then was, you're now the MP for Spen Valley.
When did I get elected? 2021. 2021,
so yeah, sort of 3-4 years.
I've been here for 3 long years.
Yeah. What are your impressions? Because obviously, and we can talk about it, but for obvious, you didn't expect to become an MP.
No.
Certainly in the circumstances you did. Now you've sort of got the measure of the place and now you're at the sort of centre of it in some ways, at least for this bit of legislation. What are your impressions of it? What do you make of it?
I don't think you ever get the measure of the place, if I'm honest. This wasn't the life that I wanted. This wasn't the career that I wanted. But my sister, Jo, always used to say to me, politics needs good people and it needs good people to step forward and to try and make a difference. And if we don't get that, then what do we get? So, but it was the biggest decision of my life to put myself forward. And the by-election was just crazy. Yeah, it was pretty toxic. It was the worst of politics in some respects. But if anything, I guess that made me even clearer that, it was the right thing to do. But politics is just a crazy world. It's mad. And there's so much good about it. And it's such a privileged job to be an MP. But it is also a bit bonkers in many ways in that you're kind of expected to know everything about everything, and no person can do that, whether that's the really big international issues that the world faces at the moment, whether it's war in the Middle East, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's, those big issues. But then you're also, in the next breath, you find yourself thinking about people's wheelie bins and potholes and giving a little assembly to a primary school. So you're kind of doing all those things and everything in between.
Do you enjoy it? Is enjoy the wrong word?
Yeah, I do. For me personally, I'm not sure there are bits of enjoyment within it, but I do find it hard. I find it stressful, and I think that's probably partly because of my personality, because I'm quite an all or nothing person. So I want to do everything really, 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 really well, and sometimes that isn't possible because you are pulled in so many different directions. But that's why I've taken such a thorough approach to the bill, because this has to be done well, and it has to be done really, really thoroughly. But yeah, look, there's some amazing people in politics. And every day is different, and we've got all these new colleagues who've come into Parliament now, and we've got some brilliant people in this place, and that should be celebrated.
What was it like taking Galloway on at that time? Because that was a vicious by-election, wasn't it? It was a really tough by. I remember covering it and seeing him, and he had his posters all over the constituency. And in some ways, I mean, you kind of saved Keir Starmer. Arguably, he's Prime Minister because of you. Because if he'd lost that by-election, which you won narrowly, but seriously, I remember that was a really tough year, and it was kind of the turning point, actually, that by-election for Labour's fortunes. It was all up after that. But
yeah. Other people said that. I mean, I probably didn't realise that at the time.
No.
It's perhaps as well that I didn't. I just
There's a lot to thank you for.
Kind of. I kind of just. I mean, to be fair, since my sister was killed, I have just put one foot in front of the other and thought about getting through every day, but also thought about trying to make a difference in whatever way that I can. And I did that initially through the charity work that we did, through the Jo Cox Foundation, through the local community work that I did around More in Common, building community, building togetherness, and focusing on the things that we have in common. And to be honest, that was one of the things that upset me most about the by-election, because it kind of put a bit of a coach and horses through that, and we'd worked really hard since Jo's murder to bring people together across Batley and Spen with some fantastic results. And then the by-election, undid some of that work, and I found that really upsetting. And I also find it really weird now that I'm an MP. You are seen differently, you are perceived differently, but I'm still the same person that I was. But you've sort of picked that job now, you've picked that career now, and you become part of the system. And I said at the time, I don't want to become part of the system. I want to find a way to make a difference, and that's all about how people feel about politics, isn't it? And what we can do about that. And I said earlier on about going into a primary school. We need better political education. We need people to understand what MPs do, what councils do, where those powers lie, and how we can actually be a force for good and how we can help people.
I think a lot of people listening to this, I certainly find this. You've mentioned Jo and her murder and the horrific circumstances in which that occurred, and the fact that you're sat more or less now for the seat that she had. You are still so optimistic. You sound optimistic anyway, albeit obviously very aware of the limitations and difficulties of politics. I think some people will find it amazing that you managed to retain your optimism. I mean, how have you done that?
Well, I think part of that is my upbringing. I've got the best parents ever, and Jo and I were brought up to be optimistic. We were brought up to be positive. We were brought up to try and find the good in everything and in everyone. But also, when something so horrific happens, and I still can't believe that Jo was killed in the way that she was. But what choice have you got? You can either shut up shop and say, I'm done, close your curtains, lock your door, or you can think, well, I'm going to try and make a difference. And I also know that that's what she would have wanted me to do, because that was everything that she believed in. I've got my parents to think about, I've got Jo's kids to think about, and what I always felt, particularly in those early days, was I want them to look back when her kids are older and say, look, this really, really horrendous thing happened, but look at what came out of it, and look at all the good things that came out of Mummy's life. And we've got so much to be proud of through the work of the Jo Cox Foundation, but also through, hopefully, me being here now and trying to make a difference. And you know what? I'm not going to be beaten. Sometimes, and it links to the bill in a way, doesn't it? Sometimes really bad things happen to good people, and the world can feel like a really unfair place. But my view on choice is that we've got a choice as to how we deal with those things. And I've just tried to do my best, which sometimes is good enough and sometimes might not be good enough, but that is what is keeping me going.
What do you think she would think of the world now? In a sense that the thing that most came out of, obviously we all sort of came to know her for in a way, is what you've just said, which is the idea of having more in common, which is that wonderful speech she made in her short time in the Commons, where she talked about the fact that we have more in common than that which divides us. Do you think she'd still think that? It's kind of hard to, when you look at the world now and look at politics, even British politics, it's hard to kind of keep that in mind, isn't it? Yeah,
it is hard, but you know what? She would never have given up, because that's who she was. She would never have stopped trying to make a difference and trying to find the good. And actually, do you know what? most people are good, irrespective of our different views. And to be fair, you see that in Parliament all the time. And working on the bill's been really interesting because it's been cross-party. You know, people have got different views on this irrespective of their political parties. And Jo did a lot of work in that regard. I've tried to do that as well, working with people across the political divide, finding the common ground, and also where we do disagree, managing to disagree respectfully and with compassion and understanding, and listening to other people's views and opinions. That's something Jo was very good at. So I think she would be saddened by some of the things that we've seen in our country and indeed around the world, which have been quite divisive, but she would never, ever have stopped fighting and trying to make a difference.
I covered Jo's death on that night, went up for a news night. And it felt, when I look back at it now, it almost feels like a sort of harbinger of a darker politics. It was a sort of moment where something seemed to change in British politics. I couldn't quite believe it, as you said, even now. I still can't quite believe that an MP was murdered in that way. We saw the same with David Amess, different sort of circumstances. But do you think, actually looking back, it was a sort of sign of something?
I think it was a symptom of where our country was and where our society was at the time. Remember, it was during the Brexit referendum debate, and things were really tense, and there was a lot of division, a lot of polarisation, and that felt really raw then. And then we had that period where people said that we need to do things differently, and we need to do all the things that I've just talked about, like finding common ground and being more respectful and more compassionate. And I just find it really sad that didn't last for very long. And actually, things, if anything, are probably a bit worse than they were then. But then I remain optimistic because we've got a new government. That was a new start. And I'm hopeful that the government can bring out about some of the changes in society that we need to see. And also, you know, I do think this term in Parliament, we have seen respectful debate, compassionate, robust debate, and that does, you know, give me optimism for the future. But there's still a lot of work to do, and we have to look at how we can change that culture. So part of that is responsibility of MPs, how we behave, because sometimes we don't, you know, cover ourselves in glory. So we've got to be respectful. We've got to look at the role of the media. And even during the debate around the private members bill, you know, there's this sensationalism about, oh, this is happening and the cabinet's split over this. And that's just not true. But it makes a juicier story than actually getting to the heart of the issue. And so the media, I think, have got a role to play. We've clearly got social media in a way that, if I think about in 2015 when Jo was killed, 2015 when Jo became an MP, and then 2016 when she was killed, social media was definitely a thing, but not like it is now. It's like so entrenched in our day-to-day lives.
Did you at the time or since, you talk about that period and the sort of intensity of it and the fever pitch of what it was like, did you and other members of your family, did you privately at least have some anger towards politicians or media or people at the time for the way the country was at that time that perhaps in some way led to those events?
I think we've all got responsibility, particularly people in positions of leadership and power, to set the tone. And I think we have seen behaviour from politicians and others who have got that wrong at times. And I think we have got a duty to keep things respectful and not stoke anger. There's a lot of anger out there, and I understand that. I'm angry about what's happened to my life. I'm absolutely pretty furious, to be honest, but I'm not going to give in to that anger, and I'm not going to let that anger manifest itself by me being horrible to other people.
You're still angry about it? You're angry about it?
Yeah, of course I am. I mean, I had a great life. I had a really good life. You know, 6 weeks before Jo was killed, we had my 40th birthday celebrations. All my friends came together. Jo came, and we were all convinced she wouldn't come because she'd be too busy, and she came, and we had this amazing weekend, and that was what my life looked like. And I think back to that now, and I think, God, I had such a good life. And I'm not saying I have a dreadful life now, but it's totally, totally different. And you know, Jo's murder didn't take place in a vacuum. It took place in an environment that was not healthy and was not good for our country. And also, to be clear, that doesn't mean that we can't all have our really strong views. I have really strong views on lots of issues. Jo did. But we will always try and be respectful.
So do you think she wouldn't have been murdered, or it might not have happened if those circumstances had been different?
Look, it's impossible to say, isn't it? It's impossible to say. And I think for me to... You know, I've still got a lot of processing to do around Jo's death, but I just think we have to look at the here and now, and we have to look at the culture that we've got now and the responsibility that we all have, whether we are an MP, whether we're a journalist, whether we're a taxi driver, or whoever we are. We've all got a responsibility to think about how we conduct ourselves.
Just finally, Kim, I mean, I suppose in a way you've alluded to it in everything that you've been saying, but thinking about those stories you were talking about, those horrendous stories of people who had a terrible death. Whatever we think about life or the value of life, there's no doubt they had a terrible, terrible death. And that there will be people out there, I mean, Esther Rantzen is one of them, of course, but there's loads of others who are, it might not even benefit them, but they're praying that this bill succeeds. It must feel like a huge responsibility.
I do feel pressure, but I'm trying not to sort of focus on that. I'm just focusing on doing the right thing and getting through. But you're right. I mean, there's people who've campaigned on this issue for decades as a result of their own personal loss. Those families are the ones that I hear their voices all the time, which enables me to keep going. There's also, let's be clear, terminally ill people like Nathaniel Dye, who I've spent a bit of time with recently. He's got terminal cancer, which is spreading to lots of different areas of his body. And, who is anybody to deny him the choice and the option of taking control over his own death? And those terminally ill people, I met others last week who are just saying, we just want that choice. And you're right, it will be too late because there's a quite a long process to go through in Parliament with the bill, but also then there will be quite a long period of implementation. It could be up to 2 years. And I feel dreadful that for some people it will be too late. But you're right, you've got high-profile campaigners like Esther Rantzen who's shown huge bravery on this issue and huge leadership on this issue. Prue Leith is another one who had 2 brothers who had very different deaths. One had what you might call a good death and the other had a very, very traumatic death. This can affect any of us. And it's amazed me the number of people who've come up to me in the street and said, thank you for doing this because this happened to me, this happened to my mum, this happened to my wife. So maybe what politicians really need to focus on is speaking to those people and addressing the problem that clearly faces us, not at the expense of having the broader discussion and debate and those other issues that we need to focus on around palliative care and on all those other things, but let's look at that problem that needs to be fixed and let's focus on helping those people.
And if this bill, if it fails, if it doesn't succeed, do you think that, it was a long time since we had the last vote, do you think that is it, at least for some time?
It could be another 10 years before it comes before Parliament. And I think there is huge appetite amongst the public to have this debate, and there's huge appetite if you look at the polling that the public believe the law should change. But I do think this is our opportunity. I think this is our time with a new government, with a Parliament that is really embracing it. And that's the other thing to say. MPs are taking this very, very seriously. They are holding roundtables in their constituents. They're speaking to me. We're holding lots of events in Parliament with different legal experts and medics and people of different backgrounds with different views. But I do think this is the time. And I would encourage colleagues on the 29th of November to make sure that we take the debate to the next stage of the debate in Parliament. And I believe that the law definitely does need to change.
Kim, thanks so much for having us in your office.
Thank you for coming.
And a lot of work over the next week, I suspect, for you. But thanks so much. Cheers. Thank you.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.